If revolutionary France was able to protect itself, it needed a new leader to take the French Empire to its greatest heights. The person who would transform France and lead it to its greatest conquests is this man here, Napoleon. So how do we get him? How do we go from a revolutionary government to the rise of this man, let alone an empire? Now, Napoleon is in many ways an example of the revolution. He comes from a minor noble family from Corsica. He has no cachet. He wouldn't have been someone important nor someone who could rise in the old regime, the ancient regime of Louis XVI. But he could find a way to advance in this new revolutionary period. During the Directory, he puts down 2 coups against the government. And from his actions, he is eventually placed in charge of a army in the Italian campaign that they were undertaking. This was supposed to be a minor theater, but Napoleon succeeds brilliantly, managing to turn his campaign into the hallmark of French success during this time period. And that's the important thing. In these actions, Napoleon recognizes that the only true national symbol left in revolutionary France is no longer the government, which has changed half a dozen times already. The true national symbol in a government and society that has had a levée en masse is the army. And he's going to use the army to help catapult himself to power. After his success in the Italian campaign, he undertakes a somewhat foolish Egyptian campaign. Vaguely, there's some argument that by invading Egypt, they're going to threaten British India. It doesn't work out, it doesn't accomplish its task, and by far the most famous result of the Egyptian campaign is French scientists discover the Rosetta Stone, so we are able to understand hieroglyphics. But Napoleon is able to successfully get back to France, and he uses his cachet, he uses his success with the military to throw a coup against the government and establish the consulate. And again, that's the most important thing to realize. What Napoleon is doing during all these conquests is pitching himself. All of his victories were used to showcase the power, the importance of Napoleon Bonaparte. Not the French state, not the French government, but him. And so this is very important because it helps establish firmly that Napoleon is the one to follow. Now, Napoleon puts in place the consulate. Now, the details of the consulate, certainly for your CLEP exam, are not that important. And indeed, the details of the consulate are not that critical because what really matters is Napoleon's in charge. And while he rules under the consulate, eventually he will go so far as to declare himself emperor in 1804. So this is really a period in which Napoleon is in charge. And so what actions does he take, and what does that tell us about Napoleon in power? Well, one of his first actions in 1801 is to come to an agreement, a concordat, with the Catholic Church. In many ways, what you should see this as is an attempt to bury the hatchet with the Catholic Church. This is Napoleon's attempt to bring peace between the Catholic Church and the French government, and, if you will, a sign that he is not planning on being the crazed radical like Robespierre. The Committee of Public Safety, by the end, was doing such things as leading the people in desecrating churches and trying to establish civic religions. This concordat shows that he's not planning to be that type of person. Secondly, he signs the Peace of Amiens, which brings an end to war. Now, given that we think of Napoleon as a general, this seems odd, but it underscores that what he recognizes is to build his power, he does need peace. Politically, what Napoleon was signaling with all of this was, again, I'm not Robespierre. You can put your faith in me. You can put your stock in me. But by far his most famous action and most important action is what he does in issuing a civil code, a new civil code, or what is also known as his Napoleonic Code. What does this code do? Well, first, the code officially and finally abolishes feudalism. It abolishes feudalism, it does away with feudalism, period, and thus the poor, the peasantry across France are thrilled with this. But it also safeguards private property, and so the middle class like this. This is a way for him to appeal to varied interests across the country of France. And most importantly, the civil code, the Napoleonic Code, is critical because it forms the basis of French administration and legal administration for decades to come. And so, in many ways, this is Napoleon's most long-lasting legacy, and the most transformative legacy also across Europe, because as he conquers, as he moves across Europe, this Napoleonic code is carried with his soldiers, carried with his administrators, and set up across much of Europe as well. But we mostly know Napoleon as a general. And the reason he is so successful is that he takes, if you will, the passion of the people, the levée en masse, the nation at arms, and he harnesses that power, harnesses that to his particular military genius. And in doing so, he creates a force of conquest far beyond anything his enemies could cope with. And, if you will, Napoleon went to war quite a bit. For all the Peace of Amiens, it only lasts for about a year before he's back at war. I talked about the resistance by the rest of Europe in the previous lecture. You can see the series of coalitions that are assembled against Napoleon. All of them come to naught. By the end of the War of the Fifth Coalition, Napoleon is functionally astride and dominant over all of Europe. The enemies of Europe are either forced allies or kowtowed neutrals. But one power remains, and that is Great Britain. And this is the fundamental problem for Napoleon. He's a great general. He's successful nearly everywhere on land, but he's not successful at sea. The British remain strong and powerful because of their navy, because, if you will, their English Channel, their moat, if you will, protecting them from the arms of Napoleon. And he can't ever solve it. He hopes that in joining the French and Spanish fleets after he puts his brother on the throne, he will have a chance of defeating the British. But famously at the Battle of Trafalgar, the British Navy, despite being outnumbered, still managed to defeat Napoleon's fleets, crushing his hopes of a naval victory. And for that reason, using his dominant political position, Napoleon instead tries a new strategy known as the continental system. What he's going to do is get all of his allies, all of his neutrals who have to do what he says, to join with him and stop trading with Great Britain. The belief is if I blockade, if you will, Britain from the continent, its economy will suffer, and it, of course, will have to submit to French rule. The problem is the world is a much more globalized economy at this point. And Britain, far from being hurt by the blockade, actually continues to do well. And the people who are actually hurt by the blockade are Napoleon's continental allies. And so they start to chafe under the continental system. Many of them start to find ways to smuggle goods out and conduct secret trade. And one of those powers is Russia. And in 1812, out of a desire to teach the Russians a lesson for standing outside the continental system, Napoleon decides to invade Russia. Napoleon invades with a massive army, over 600,000 men, and he attempts to move forward to try and get a huge victory against his Russian opponents. But unfortunately for him, the Russians trade space for time and rely on, if you will, general winter. Napoleon eventually conquers Moscow, but without a great victory, without the Russians defeated at his feet, and he is forced to retreat. And in the retreat, the forces of the Russians sniping at his heels, the deathly cold cuts his army to ribbons. At the end of the retreat, only 40,000 Frenchmen are able to make it back to Paris. Now, given that Napoleon had played the role of conqueror across Europe, often putting friends and relatives on the thrones of Europe, what do you think the reaction might be of Europeans to hearing that Napoleon had suffered a great defeat? Well, unsurprisingly, it was that the nations of Europe decided to rise up and throw him off. It was in reaction to this news of Napoleon's defeat in Russia that led the Prussian king to issue that "To my people" declaration. And all of this leads to an assembled mass of European powers meeting at the Battle of Leipzig and defeating Napoleon. Thereafter, they are able to press into France and force Napoleon to abdicate his throne, if you will, and be exiled to Elba, an island off the Italian coast. Now, why wasn't Napoleon killed, you might ask? Well, European powers didn't want a martyr. They were hoping they could just sort of box Napoleon away. And as we'll talk about in our next lecture, these are the same powers that are trying to find a workable peace at the Congress of Vienna. The last thing they need to do is kill Napoleon and make France rise up against them. However, any hopes that they'll restrain or keep Napoleon at bay are ruined by the fact that Napoleon escapes. He leaves Elba, makes it back to France, is able to rally the people to his side, and during the famed 100 days, raises an army to try and reconquer and recapture his glory when he is ultimately defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by British and Prussian forces. In response, Napoleon is exiled this time to St. Helena, an island not off the coast of Italy, but off the coast of Africa, the hope being that, well, finally we've exiled him away far enough that he won't cause any problems. Now, Napoleon would die in exile, but he remains to this day a symbol of victorious France. His tomb is at the centerpiece of the French Army Museum in Paris, an example to all Frenchmen of the glories that French arms could achieve. But with his death, European leaders were left with a new question. Now what? Just because you've defeated Napoleon doesn't mean the French Revolution went away, does it? Well, that's the question that the rest of Europe attempts to tackle at the Congress of Vienna, which is what we're going to turn to next.